Scotland is becoming wilder. Nature is slowly regenerating, and wildlife is returning to the landscape, which is why we decided to work with our partners to set up a network of hidden cameras and try to capture the secret lives that inhabit the Scottish Highlands.
Deep in the forests of Scotland, hidden cameras were set up to capture a conservation success story. Beavers had finally returned after centuries of absence.
As you see now, there are masses of dog prints everywhere. And that's when I knew we had something different on the river. I found a few pieces of wood that had been cut. You could see gnaw marks in it. And I was able to say, oh, we've got a beaver present.
And everything seemed to be going exactly as planned. But when researchers began reviewing the footage, they noticed something they couldn't explain. And what they discovered raised questions no one was prepared to answer. The ghost of the glen. Back in 1900, if you walked along a Scottish river, you would see a lot of water, but zero beavers. They were totally gone, and for 400 years, not a single one lived in these glens. These animals didn't just leave on their own, though. Humans hunted them until the very last one died out in the late 1500s. People wanted their fur because it made the best hats in Europe. They also wanted an oily slime that beavers make called castoreum. Doctors back then thought this slime could cure headaches and fever. So everyone went out with traps and guns, and by the time the 16th century ended, the rivers were void of these creatures. When the beavers died, the land changed in a way that most people didn't even notice at first. Without beavers to build dams, the water's movement started to change. Instead of slow pools and messy wetlands, the rivers started flowing pretty fast. This sounds like a good thing, but it was actually a disaster for the ground. Without those messy dams, the water moved with what we could easily describe as anger. When it rained hard, the rivers would swell up and tear the soil right off the banks. Villages started to flood way more often because there was nothing to slow the water down. The big green marshes turned into dry dirt, and all the tiny fish, bugs, and birds that lived in those wet spots just lost their homes. For hundreds of years, Scottish people forgot what a healthy river even looked like. They thought a straight, fast river was normal. They didn't know their ancestors lived in a world where the water was held back by millions of sticks and mud walls. Maps showed straight blue lines, and that was that. The great forests of the West began to shrink because the ground was too dry. The land was thirsty, but the water was moving too fast for the earth to take a drink. As the years went by, scientists started looking at old books and digging in the mud. They found old beaver bones buried deep down, and they realized the flooding and the dry land weren't just bad luck. It was happening because a key worker was missing from the job site. The land was broken because the engineers were dead. By the time the late 90s rolled around, a few experts started asking very valid questions. What if we brought them back? What if we let these animals return to the water and see if they can fix what we broke? It took years of arguing and a lot of paperwork to get a yes. But when the gates finally opened, nobody was ready for how fast these animals would start working. The 10 million person experiment. Getting the green light to bring beavers back was not easy. The team spent years filling out forms and arguing with leaders before they got a yes. In 2005, the first plan was actually rejected because people were worried about old ruins and farm fields. It took until 2008 for the government to give out a license. This was the first time in history that a mammal was legally brought back to Britain after being gone. Because it was so new, every single move had to be recorded. Over 10 million people followed the news as the project started. The experts picked out 11 beavers from a place in Norway called Telemark. They chose these specific animals because their DNA was a good match for the cold weather in Scotland. Before they could touch the water, they went into a strict quarantine at a zoo. Dr. Bob Bell, a top vet, led the medical team to check for any diseases or parasites because they did not want to risk the local wildlife getting sick. Once the health checks passed, the beavers were moved in climate-controlled crates to Knapdale Forest. On May 28, 2009, The first pair went into Loch Duv, a small, deep freshwater lake surrounded by steep hills and thick birch trees that locals call Dub Block. The next day, May 29th, 2 more families were put into Loch Cuil Bar, a much larger lake nearby that is famous for its narrow channels and tall reeds. The team spread them out across 3 different lochs, so they would have enough space to find food without fighting. This area covered 44 square kilometers of forest and water. Every beaver had a special mark and a GPS tag, so the team knew exactly where they slept every night. The monitoring was the most intense in British history. NatureScott and the University of Exeter set up a massive tech grid. They put high-frequency flow gauges in the streams to measure water speed and pressure sensors on the lake floors to track depth changes down to the millimeter. On land, rangers walked set paths called transects. They counted every single dragonfly, frog, and fish in the area to create a baseline and see if the numbers changed after the beavers arrived. The scientists used camera traps that turned on when they saw movement at night. They also took DNA samples from the water to track where the beavers were living. They even checked the dirt and chemicals in the water every month. Every bit of data went into a 5-year review. If the beavers caused too much trouble or did not survive, the government had the right to take them all out. The beavers spent their first few weeks finding willow and alder trees to eat. They used their teeth to cut down small trees and dragged them into the water. They started making muddy slides on the banks, where they moved wood back and forth. The scientists watched the screens and waited for the first signs of building. They wanted to see if these 11 animals could actually manage a whole forest. The architecture of instinct. As the rain started to fall over Knapdale, the 11 beavers got straight to work. Their brains are hardwired to fix any spot where they hear the sound of running water. To a beaver, the sound of a leak is like an alarm clock going off. They moved through the dark water and found the perfect gaps between the roots of old alder trees. Using their front paws like little hands, they began to shove thick branches into the mud. They tucked the big ends of the sticks into the dirt so the current would not wash them away. Each night, the building grew bigger. The beavers picked out specific trees like willow and birch. Because the wood is bendy and strong, they chewed the branches into the right size and dragged them down their muddy slides into the stream. They wove these stems together just like a person weaves a basket. Then, they dove to the bottom of the loch to scoop up double handfuls of heavy gray mud. They swam back to the wall and slapped the mud into the cracks to seal them shut. They even used flat stones and clumps of tall grass to make the wall heavy so it would stay put. By the second year, the rangers found over a dozen of these dams. Some were small, just a few feet across, but others were over 20 meters long. Each one was built a little differently to fit the ground. Some dams were straight across the water, while others curved like a bow to hold back the weight of the stream. Behind every dam, the water began to spread out into the woods. It filled up old holes and low spots that had been dry for a long time. The beavers also built lodges, which are big mounds of sticks where they sleep and keep their babies safe from predators. These lodges have hidden underwater doors so no one can get inside. The beavers did not just build one wall and stop. They made a whole series of dams that looked like stairs going down the valley. If a hole opened up in a dam during a big storm, they were out there within minutes to patch it up with fresh mud and wood. They worked with a kind of focus that no human builder can match. They changed the layout of the valley, and soon, what used to be a fast, thin stream was now a giant puzzle of deep pools and slow, winding paths. The rangers kept detailed notes on every new stick and stone. They saw that the trees near the water were starting to grow back even thicker because the beavers were pruning them like gardeners. The whole valley was starting to look like a messy, wet paradise. But while the beavers were busy with their sticks, the scientists were looking at their computer screens back at the lab. The numbers they were seeing were totally impossible, and they realized the beavers were doing something to the water that no human engineer had ever predicted. The hydrologist's nightmare. Dr. Emma Thompson and the team from the University of Exeter arrived at Knapdale with a clear plan. They had the best tools money could buy to track the water. They set up high-tech gauges in the streams that could measure the speed of the current every few seconds. They also put sensors on the bottom of the locks to watch the water levels move up or down by a single millimeter. All this info went into a complex computer model. This model was built to predict exactly how a flood would move through the valley after a big storm. For years, these computer models had been right, but as the Beavers built more dams, the models started to fail. In the winter of 2011, a massive storm hit the west coast of Scotland. The rain was heavy and did not stop for days. Normally, this much water would rush down the hills and turn the small streams into fast, dangerous rivers. The computer model predicted the water would hit the bottom of the valley in less than an hour. But when the scientists looked at their screens, the water wasn't there yet. They waited another hour, and still, the sensors showed the water was moving slow. The data was so weird that the team thought the batteries in their gear had died. They went out into the rain to check the sensors by hand. What they found was a nightmare for a traditional engineer. The Beavers had built over 100 dams by this point. Each dam acted like a tiny speed bump. Instead of the rain hitting the river and racing to the sea, it was getting caught in a giant maze of mud and sticks. The water would fill up one pool, then slowly spill over into the next one, and then the next. The sensors showed a 2.5-hour delay in the flood peak. That means the water took way longer to reach the towns downstream than it ever had before. The computer models could not understand how a bunch of messy sticks could hold back millions of liters of water so well. The lead hydrologist looked at the logs and saw that the peak flow of the flood had dropped by 60%. That is quite massive. And it is the difference between a river staying in its banks and a river destroying a bridge. The team realized their machines and math were missing something huge. The Beavers were turning the entire floor of the valley into a giant, leaky sponge. This sponge was soaking up the rain and letting it out slowly over many days, instead of all at once. This came as quite a shock, especially for these experts, because it seemed like a group of rodents was doing a better job of protecting the land than any human-made drainage system. The salmon paradox. In all these, the biggest worry for the Scottish government was the Atlantic salmon. These fish are a massive part of Scotland's history and its money. Salmon are born in tiny streams, swim to the ocean, and then must jump back up the same streams to lay their eggs. People were terrified that a thick wall of sticks and mud would act like a locked door. If the salmon could not get past the beaver dams, the whole fish population might crash. Fisheries manager Rob Needham and his team watched the streams in Argyll and Tayside very closely. They did find some spots where the water was low in the summer and the fish got stuck. In one spot on the Shochi Burn, a beaver built a dam right over a concrete fish pass that humans had built. The salmon were trapped in a pool below, circling for days. To fix this, the teams had to step in. They found that it cost about £1,180 every time they had to go out and help the fish. They didn't tear the whole dam down, though. They used a trick called notching. They cut a small slot, only 30 centimeters wide, into the top of the dam. This let the fish through, but kept the beaver's pond mostly full. In the River Isla, they tracked young salmon called smolts and found that 94% of them made it through these notched dams easily. But the real shocker happened when scientists looked at the young fish living behind the dams. While the adults just needed to pass through, the babies needed a place to grow. Before the beavers arrived, the straight, fast rivers were actually dangerous for tiny fish. The water moved too hard, and there were no places to hide from birds or bigger fish. The beaver dams changed everything by creating deep, cool pools where the water moved very slowly. These ponds were full of bugs and tiny plants for the salmon to eat. When the researchers counted the fish, they found that the juvenile salmon living in beaver ponds were bigger and stronger than the ones in the open river. The messy sticks provided millions of tiny hiding spots, The dams also caught silt and dirt, making the water downstream much clearer. This meant the gravel beds where salmon lay their eggs stayed clean instead of getting buried in mud. So it turned out that there was no need to worry in the first place. The fact is, the fish and the beavers had lived together for thousands of years before humans arrived, and they already knew exactly how to help each other out. And the problem was only in the minds of the people watching from the bank. The living filter. The fish was not the only thing the beavers were helping. You see, the transformation in Knapdale was not just about the amount of water, but also about how clean it was. Before the beavers arrived, the straight rivers acted like a fast drain for the surrounding hills. When it rained, the water washed dirt, farm chemicals, and animal waste directly into the locks. This created cloudy brown water that was bad for fish and plants. Scientists from Nature Scott and the University of Exeter set up high-tech sensors called turbidity meters, both above and below the beaver dams. These tools measure exactly how much mud is floating in the water. What the sensors found was a massive win for the environment. The beaver dams were acting like a giant, natural coffee filter. As the muddy water hit the slow pools behind a dam, the heavy dirt and silt would drop to the bottom. The water that spilled over the top of the sticks was much clearer. The data showed that the amount of mud in the water dropped by 15% once it passed through a beaver site. This is a huge deal for salmon because they need clean, gravelly riverbeds to lay their eggs. If too much mud covers the gravel, the baby fish suffocate. The beavers were literally cleaning the nursery. The filters did more than just catch mud. The team also took monthly water samples to check for invisible chemicals like nitrates and phosphates. These usually come from fertilizers on nearby land and can cause nasty green slime called algae to grow in the water. The beaver dams were packed with a thick layer of gray mud, dead leaves, and tiny plants. This messy mix is actually a chemical lab that traps the fertilizers and lets tiny bugs and plants eat them up before they can flow downstream. The lab tests showed that nitrate levels dropped by 12% and phosphates fell by 8%. The beavers were also fixing the acidity of the water. In many parts of Scotland, the rain and the soil can be very acidic, which is tough on many types of life. The beavers helped balance the pH levels by slowing the water down and letting it soak into the ground. The water coming out of the beaver pools had more dissolved oxygen, which makes it much easier for fish to breathe. This was all happening 24 hours a day without a single human worker or an expensive water treatment plant. The 11 beavers had turned a dying river into a living system that cleaned itself using nothing but instinct and mud. A cascade of life. The success of the clean water and slow currents meant that the forest was no longer just a place for trees, but a massive, wet home for thousands of other creatures. In the past, the river was too fast for many animals to survive, but the 11 beavers changed the entire rules of the forest. Scientists call this the beaver effect, and they used trapping grids and cameras to count every new neighbor that moved in. One of the biggest winners was the water vole. These tiny, furry swimmers were almost extinct in the area because they had nowhere to hide from predators like the mink. The data from the rangers showed something amazing. The water vole index, which is how experts count them, went up by 4 times in just 10 years because the beavers had built the perfect home for them. The messy banks of the beaver ponds were full of thick plants called sedges that voles love to eat. The tangled sticks in the dams also gave the voles a million places to hide their burrows. It wasn't just the voles either. The still water in the ponds became a nursery for billions of insects. Dragonflies started to zip over the water like tiny helicopters. Because the water was slow and full of dead wood, the number of water bugs jumped by nearly 80%. This massive surge in bugs acted like a free buffet for everyone else. Birds like the water rail and the sedge warbler moved into the new reed beds to build their nests. These birds hadn't been seen nesting in these spots for a very long time. Even the otters came back. They loved hunting for the fat fish that lived in the deep pools behind the mud walls. The scientists also found that the trees were changing. When a beaver chews on a willow or an alder tree, it doesn't usually kill the tree. Instead, it acts like a giant pair of scissors. The tree responds by sending out lots of new green shoots. This created a thick, bushy forest floor that was perfect for nesting birds and deer. The rangers saw deer tracks everywhere in the new mud, and just like that, every level of the food web was growing, from the tiny bugs in the silt To the big birds in the sky, the whole valley was finally waking up. The Tayside Outlaws. While the scientists in Knapdale were busy counting every stick and bug, an equally large story was unfolding on the other side of Scotland. In the wide, flat lands of the Tay catchment, people started seeing something they didn't expect. They saw big, flat tails splashing in the river and willow trees chewed into the shape of pencils. But these weren't the 11 beavers from the official study. These were the outlaws. These beavers didn't come from Norway with a government license. Instead, they were Bavarian beavers that had either escaped from private collections or were let go in secret by people who didn't want to wait for the law.
This is where beavers first came back to Scotland. And how beavers first came back to the River Tay is actually really significant because it wasn't done through licensed and official reintroductions.
By 2012, while the Knapdale trial was still being debated in offices, these secret families were already taking over. One farmer in Perthshire told the news that it felt like a beaver boomtown was popping up overnight. The expansion was massive and fast. In 2012, there were only about 150 beavers in the Tay area. But by 2017, that number jumped to over 430. By 2021, the population had doubled again to nearly 1,000 beavers. Today, experts think there are more than 2,000 beavers living across Scotland. They moved from a few small streams into 6 major river systems. They were spreading their mud and stick engineering across the whole country at a speed that left the government gasping for air. As you might expect, this rapid growth caused a lot of friction. Unlike the woods of Knapdale, the Tay area has a lot of expensive farmland. Farmers started waking up to find their flat, low fields turned into lakes. Drainage pipes that were meant to keep the soil dry were being stuffed full of willow branches by the beavers. The secret population was doing exactly what beavers do best, but they were doing it in places where humans were trying to grow crops. Nature Scott had to move fast to keep up. They used cameras, DNA tests, and experts on the ground to map out where these new families were moving. The data showed that a single beaver family usually takes up about a mile of the river, and they have about 8 or 9 babies and relatives living together. With so many families moving in, the old way of managing the land wasn't as effective anymore. The government had to decide if they were going to fight these new engineers or find a way to live alongside them. This led to a brand new set of tools that changed the way Scotland looks at its wild neighbors forever. Coexistence. The explosion of the outlaw beavers across Tayside meant the government could no longer just sit back and watch. At first, the main way to deal with beavers that caused trouble was to shoot them. In 2021 alone, 87 beavers were killed under official licenses. But as people saw how much good the beavers were doing for the water and the birds, the public mood changed. People wanted a way to keep the beavers without losing the farms, and this led to a brand new toolkit for living together. Nature Scott and their monitoring lead, Dr. Martin Gaywood, started to look for ways to fix problems without using a gun. One of the smartest tools they used is called a flow device. If a beaver dam is flooding a farm road, workers don't tear the dam down. Instead, they stick a long plastic pipe right through the middle of it. The pipe lets the water level stay exactly where the humans want it, but the beavers think their dam is still working fine. It is a simple way to trick the beavers into being good neighbors. Another tool in the kit is surgical dam notching. Instead of a total demolition, teams use hand tools to cut a narrow slot in the dam. This lets fish swim through during the dry months, but keeps the pond deep enough for the beavers to feel safe. In the River Isla, these trials were a massive success. They found that 94% of the young salmon could navigate these notched dams without any trouble. It proved that with a little bit of help, the fish and the beavers could get along just fine. When a beaver family is just in the wrong spot, like a high-value fruit farm, the government now uses relocation. In 2023, 79 beavers were trapped and moved to new areas where they were actually wanted. This has worked so well that the number of beavers killed dropped from 87 in 2021 to just 23 recently. Most of these moved beavers go to new projects in the south of Scotland or even down to England. The scientists are also fixing the family tree of the beavers. Because the first 11 beavers were all from the same spot in Norway, They didn't have a lot of variety in their DNA. To fix this, experts brought in beavers from Germany in 2018 and 2024. This made the whole population much stronger and healthier. All of this work is part of a giant plan called the Beaver Strategy, which runs all the way to 2045. It is a roadmap for a country that has finally decided to let nature take the lead. This new way of thinking is now spreading far beyond the borders of Scotland, changing how the rest of Britain looks at its own wild rivers. The return of the engineers. The success with the new toolkit proved that Scotland was finally ready to stop fighting the water, and working with the animals that manage the flow became the new goal. What started with just 11 beavers in a small forest has now become a national movement. The Beaver Strategy 2022 to 2045 is the official plan to help these animals reclaim their old homes in every major river across the country. Experts now think the population could grow to 10,000 beavers by the end of this decade. These animals are now a permanent part of the Scottish map. This new way of thinking is moving fast beyond the borders of the Highlands. The River Otter project in Devon, England, followed the exact same path as Knapdale.
The village of East Budleigh, situated just west of the River Otter, had suffered from flooding for years. But now, there's a new beaver dam upstream.
After watching the Scottish data, the UK government announced in February 2025 that wild beaver releases would finally be allowed across all of England. Even Wales is now looking at the maps and the flow gauges to see where they can let the beavers back in. The lessons from those first 11 survivors are being used to rewrite the rules for water quality and flood safety for the entire island. In the past, people thought that managing a river meant building higher concrete walls and digging deeper, straight trenches. Many believed nature was something that needed to be controlled with machines and money. But the beavers showed everyone that our most expensive engineering was actually causing the very problems we were trying to fix. Removing these animals 400 years ago did not give us better rivers. Instead, we got a broken system that could not handle a storm. The footage from the release revealed that the most disturbing thing was never the animal, but our own failure to understand the land. Now that we know a simple rodent can outperform a multi-million-pound flood wall, is it time to admit that our modern technology is actually the weakest tool we have? If 11 beavers can fix a river in a few years, does that mean we have been the true invasive species for the last 4 centuries? Leave your answers in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching. And if you enjoy this video, please click on the next one on your screen.